Writing to Dublin Castle on the 6th of November 1796, the Reverend William Lambert at Edenderry conveyed to the government in Dublin that it was, quote, the intention of the defenders to rise on the 17th of this month and to massacre the Protestants, and that he was in no doubt that the French would make a landing about this time. The vigilant Lambert had recently obtained this information after the arrest of a man called Dennis Delaney, a United Irishman. Lambert had passed this and other discoveries to the Dublin Castle administration. He was not alone in doing this, and with constant contact with Dublin Castle, the letters of Shaw Cartland, William Lambert, Thomas Dames and John Everard, amongst others, provide us with an account of their daily occurrence of robberies and crimes in the northeastern part of Kings County in the lead up to the 1798 rebellion. The aim of this lecture is to provide an overview of what life was like in Kings County in the lead up to and during the 1798 rebellion, principally in the baronies of Coulstown and Warrenstown, located in the northeast of Kings County, or Offaly as it is known today. At this time, the main centres of population in these baronies were centred on the town of Edenderry and the nearby village of Rode. In the mid-1790s, Kings County was a hotbed of seditious activity, and one which was greatly feared by the authorities in Dublin. There was every reason to believe that if rebellion broke out in the mid-1790s, Kings County would play a major role. However, this was not the case, and as Jean Winder comments, quote, when the political situation reached boiling point in 1798, the dry land in Kings County seems to have been saturated with military presence as the bogs were with water. But first, let us consider what has led us to this stage and why was rebellion in the air in the spring of 1798. In 1791, a group styling itself the Society of United Irishmen, and inspired by the American and French revolutions, was established first in Belfast and then in Dublin. The membership of both groups was middle class, but Presbyterians predominated in the Belfast Society, while the Dublin Society was made up of Catholics and Protestants. The Society's main objectives were parliamentary reform and the ending of the penal laws. By 1795, however, an alliance between predominantly Presbyterian radicals and discontented sections of the working class had radicalised the Society of United Irishmen along secret, non-sectarian and military lines. Agrarian discontent was rife throughout the country, and many of the lower orders who had formed themselves into secret societies of their own now looked to join this new society. At the same time, Theobald Wolfe Tone, one of the founding members of the United Irishmen, had gone to France to secure help for a rebellion. Tone succeeded in raising a force, and in late 1796 a large French expedition sailed for Ireland under the command of General Lazare Hoche. Although the French fleet reached Bantry Bay off the coast of County Cork, a military invasion was denied, largely because of bad weather. But the British government were severely threatened by this attempted foreign invasion and, in turn, decided to introduce an Insurrection Act in 1796 and suspended the Habeas Corpus Act. In 1797, General Gerard Lake confiscated private arms in the north of Ireland and in other parts and suppressed the Northern Star, the United Irishmen's radical newspaper published in Belfast. In the early months of 1798, tension greatly increased throughout the country. The United Irishmen were, in many parts, openly planning a rebellion, and the government was desperately trying to break this organisation. The government managed to arrest a number of the leading figures of the United Irishmen in the spring, but ultimately it proved unable to prevent the breaking out of rebellion in May of 1798. But first, let us consider what King's County was like in the lead up to the 1798 rebellion. There was a growing discontent amongst the inhabitants of King's County during the 1780s and early 1790s. At Edenderry, for example, despite the best efforts of John Hatch, the land agent in charge of the Blundell and later Downshire estates, the town was said to be going down fast, and the decline of the woolen industry resulted in riots and disturbances in that part of the county, mainly caused by high prices of provisions and the shortage of food. In 1783, for example, after a visit to the town, Hatch relayed to Maria Blundell, daughter of Lord Blundell, that, quote, there was not a potato or grain of corn in the market. In Rode and Phillipstown, now known as Dangan, the situation was much the same. Yet there were some signs of progress and development which temporarily lifted the gloom surrounding King's County. One such improvement was the coming of the Grand Canal, which by 1798 was meandering its way through the county. Writing about the canal in 1771, Charles Vallancey had noted that the peasantry were starving and, quote, nothing would contribute so much to the relief as inland navigation. That relief did come, and from Edenderry to Tullamore, the lead up to the 1798 rebellion saw thousands of tons of earth moved, creating employment as the canal meandered its way through the towns and villages of the county. The coming of the canal had also brought newcomers to the area, who brought with them and spread the ideals of the French Revolution and also that of the secret societies. Secret societies in Ireland had emerged in the 1760s when a group styling themselves White Boys had terrorised society in County Tipperary and neighbouring areas. They soon spread to other parts of the country, and they went by a multitude of names. In King's County you had groups such as the Caravats, the Shanavets and the Rockites, while in other parts of the country the generic term ribbonmen was often affixed to these lawless groups. In the 1790s, secret societies were agrarian in outlook, content with settling old scores, preventing access to land by newcomers, resisting eviction, and in general to establishing a code which they had been set down by themselves. In Edenderry, a fear of outside labour, which had been brought into the county with the coming of the Grand Canal, exacerbated tensions considerably. A number of courts-martial, which were held in the wake of the 1798 rebellion, provide remarkable evidence as to the activities and the workings of this defender movement in King's County throughout the 1790s. The case of Edward Allen and Michael Costello in 1800 was one such trial, where the defender plot to murder John Wakely, a magistrate and justice of the peace at Rode, came to light. As early as 1795, John Wakely had become a prime target for the group styling themselves the Defenders, who planned to raid his home at Ballyburley near Rode and murder him. The Defenders were a well-organised body and had in their ranks several chaplains, a court for trying people guilty of crime, and a grand jury to decide the outcome of such events. At the trial of two prisoners named Allen and Costello in 1800, the outcome of one such defender court was relayed, when William Welch and Patrick de Boer were charged with having struck a man named Frank Gore, and were duly summoned to a trial held in Anthony Kennedy's Bog. There, in Kennedy's Bog, the two men were duly reprimanded for their actions. However, the defenders were now calling themselves true-born Frenchmen, and the defender conspiracy was gathering pace, and 1796 would prove how well organised they were and how disaffected they had become. The defender conspiracy duly gathered pace in 1796, and the inhabitants of the northeast of King's County lived in fear of the almost daily threat of robberies and outrages. The magistrates of the baronies of Coulstown and Warrenstown concluded, quote, that a strong military force was indispensably necessary for the area, after the withdrawal of the Drogheda militia, which had been stationed at Edenderry. Shaw Cartland informed Dublin Castle, quote, that we never had more cause to apprehend the breaking out of disturbance than we have at present. In Rhodes, he said, a man had been murdered for refusing to take the Defender oath, and the deep-rooted nature of the Defender Society was evident when at the subsequent assizes no approvers could be found to testify against the culprits of the Rhodes murder. The law-abiding people at Edenderry had written to Lord Downshire, asking for help in defending their homes from the increasing Defender mayhem. Writing from Dublin Castle, Lord Camden assured Downshire that General Craig was in a position to deploy sufficient forces to satisfy the people of King's County. Throughout all of this period, Camden and others at Dublin Castle were kept abreast of the Defender conspiracy in King's County, principally by the aforementioned Shaw Cartland of Rhodes. Cartland, the son of a Scottish landowner, was born in 1741 and died in 1823, and throughout his long life in King's County was an influential magistrate, middleman and yeoman residing between Edenderry and the village of Rhodes. He was principally responsible for curbing the threat of Defenderism in the northeast part of the county, and as a government informant he was handsomely rewarded for his efforts. Although many of his activities and exertions could well be seen as efforts to appease his landlord, the Marquess of Downshire, to whom he was in a considerable debt and had accumulated large arrears, he was nonetheless an influential player in the story of 1798 in King's County. As I mentioned, he was a substantial landowner in the county and owned at least 3 large houses in the Edenderry area: Ballykillen, built in 1754, Lumville, built in 1784, and Leitrim, near Rhodes, built in 1813. One record of Lumville at this time noted that, quote, Mr. Cartland's domain at Lumville is excellent land and well planted, full of fine timber, and the country is woody and the plantations well triven. Cartland also owned property at Geeshel and in counties Meath and Dublin. Today, Cartland Bridge along the banks of the Grand Canal between Edenderry and Rhodes is named in his honour. With the upsurge of secret society activity in the baronies of Coulstown and Warrenstown, a yeomanry corps was soon established, who, with their uniforms of scarlet and blue, recruited a network of spies and informers with the intention of suppressing the illegal activity of the Defender movement. This yeomanry corps consisted of 42 volunteers drawn from the Edenderry and Rhodes area, with John Wakely of Ballyburley as captain, Thomas Dames of Green Hills as lieutenant, and Charles Palmer of Rahan as an officer. The yeomanry corps was overwhelmingly Protestant composition, but did include one Catholic, a man named Everard. Despite these successes, Cartland and others were genuinely worried and informed government that they remain base to be murdered in their homes and that the Defenders are playing the devil around Edenderry. However, the nightly patrols of yeomanry around Coulstown and Warrenstown failed to lift many of these Defenders, who in June 1796 were said to have attacked and carried away arms from a house during divine service. Another daring attempt was made by the Defenders, who attacked the jail of Dangan to secure the release of prisoners, but were repulsed. The failure of the assizes to prosecute Defenders increased the sense of fear amongst the landowners of King's County, who were victims of many of the Defender attacks. Likewise, the failure to prosecute stemmed from the fact that some of the informers had been threatened by Defenders. These included a man called Francis Carey, who had been held at knife point and made swear that he would be, quote, true to the French when they landed, and that he would assist in the coming revolution. As a result of these actions, and through bribery, the approvers that had been gathered for the spring assizes of 1797 denied everything that they had previously sworn to the magistrate. As already alluded to, what was also significant in King's County in the build-up to the 1798 rebellion was the importance of the coming of the canal to the county. This went in both ways. Firstly, the building works meant that outsiders were brought in to carry out the work, and they brought with them the ideals of the United Irishmen and the Defender movement, and of radicalism in general. And secondly, with transport along the canal allowing people to move to and from Dublin and home again within a relatively short period of time, They too carried with them the news from the Society of United Irishmen in the capital. By 1796 the canal had reached Dangan and Edenderry, but the boats operating on the Grand Canal were also a target for the defenders, who were plundering goods being brought to and from Dublin. In response to these threats, the Grand Canal Company formed its own yeomanry corps of canal employees around Edenderry to suppress defenderism and to preserve the public peace. A blunderbuss and a case of pistols were purchased for the safety of each passage boat travelling the Grand Canal between Edenderry and Dangan. For the authorities in Kings County, the presence of radicals from outside the county spelled trouble. In October 1796 it was reported that 300 defenders had met in a bog near Edenderry and were addressed by a gentleman from the county Westmeath, who spoke about the coming of the French. However, the authorities had somewhat of a turning point with the capture of a man called Dennis Delaney, which provided irrefutable evidence that the defenders in Kings County had adopted the ideals of the United Irishmen. A deserter from the Queen's County Militia, Delaney was arrested and found to have in his possession the resolutions of the United Irishmen, a rebellious song about the king and country, and secret admission papers for the society. Detained in Edenderry, Delaney was also found to contain documents with the initials HJMC, which Lambert and others concluded were those of Henry Joy McCracken, one of 4 brothers from County Antrim involved in the United Irishman conspiracy. The whole period, however, was one of victory and setback for the authorities and the yeomanry. There were still many setbacks for the Coulstown and Warrenstown yeomanry, and some hideous crimes reflected this, including the murder of Isaac Bagnall at Tuberdaly near Road on the 8th of February 1797. The murder of Bagnall and his wife Sarah was particularly violent and showed that old scores were being settled by the defenders. Prior to the murder of the Bagnalls, there had been numerous house robberies in the area, attested to with great instances of cruelty and an eagerness to carry off firearms by the defenders. Bagnall, who was described as being an honest, industrious Protestant, was targeted for a number of reasons, and the trial of Thomas Maypowther and Henry Proctor from Edenderry in 1797 outlined the cruelty with which the Bagnalls had met their end. The youngest of the Bagnalls, Mary, who while staying at Edenderry with relatives, identified 2 of her parents' assassins. Attacking the house at Tuberdaly near Road, the defenders demanded arms and threatened to burn down the house, which they duly did. They also looked for money, which Sarah Bagnall kept in a box, which shows that the perpetrators were familiar both with the household and its contents. Having recovered from being shot in the chin, John Bagnall recalled being shot at as he dragged his parents from the burning house. More than 27 men were arrested for their part in the attack on the Bagnalls, including one man named Pender from Edenderry, but only Maypowther and Proctor stood trial. As was the case with several defender trials at this time, the accused received several good character references and were acquitted of the murder, despite the pleas of William Lambert and Thomas Dames respectively. The Yeomanry Corps in Warrenstown and Coulstown did have some success in 1797. By the end of the year they had managed to secure extra troops for the area, which included the Wicklow Militia and the Royal Artillery. The Wicklow Militia were under the command of Captain Hempenstall and were stationed at Edenderry. Towards the end of the summer, they inflicted heavy damage on houses of suspected rebels in the surrounding countryside. However, why this measure was not adopted in the Road area, where the militia were surrounded by defenders, is interesting. Despite this, the infantry in Kings County were praised by Thomas Pelham for their zealous and loyal exertions. Other successes for the yeomanry against defenders were reported when Lambert commented that a number of the idle and disorderly fellows were placed in jail, which had resulted in the county becoming quiet and robberies ceasing about this time. Others, however, were high in the spirit that the French will be here in less than 3 weeks, and then the rebellion would commence. Because of such beliefs, and just as before, the defenders were once again emboldened to strike back at the authorities. In September, William Evans, barrack master on the Grand Canal, wrote of the large gatherings of defenders in the northeast of Kings County, and that despite stern measures, the attacks on houses for arms and money continued. The High Sheriff of Kings County, Thomas Dames of Green Hills, was convinced that the gentlemen would quit their country homes once the winter set in, and this would create further anarchy and dismay. Likewise, following the summer assizes at Philipstown, John Pollock, Clerk of the Crown for Leinster, wrote that, in his opinion, there existed an unequivocal determination to subvert the King's government, another attempt to prosecute offenders having failed. A visiting judge of the county, Robert Day, also commented that the gentlemen of the surrounding baronies had barricaded their homes and had no intention of abandoning their defensive system or relaxing their precautions until the winter was over. Without a military presence in the area, Pollock informed Dublin Castle the consequences of the coming winter for Kings County could be disastrous. The military, he claimed, by suppressing insurrection, would encourage the gentry to remain in their house during the winter. The magistrates of the area, it was claimed, had done all they could for the public good, but they were not helped by the indiscipline in the ranks of the yeomanry, such as the Kerry militia and the Scotch regiment, who were accused of rioting with each other and in causing disturbance in Kings County towards the end of the summer. As the year ended, the seizure by defenders of a boat destined for Dangan with a consignment of arms had, according to Lord Downshire, quote, made a deep impression on the minds of the disaffected here, who were growing in confidence all the time. However, in 1798, the defenders and United Irishmen would not have the same freedom of movement to carry out their outrages in Kings County. In his article, The 1798 Rebellion in North Leinster, Liam Chambers states that many historians rarely write about why rebellion did not happen in 1798. As has been shown, Kings County, and in particular the northeast corner of it, and centred on Edenderry and Road, were heavily disturbed during the 1790s, and it was reasonable to assume that the area would pose a problem for the government should rebellion break out. However, the garrisoning of towns such as Edenderry and the exertion of the magistrates ensured that no rebellion would break out in the summer of 1798. The government and forces employed at Edenderry, for example, managed to pacify large parts of Kings County and were helped by the issuing of an Insurrection Act in April 1798 and an order from General Abercrombie that previous month that the county was to be disarmed. This was followed by the posting of a proclamation by Abercrombie threatening of the dire consequences the people would face if they failed to hand in their weapons. The stationing of troops at Edenderry who lived at free quarters amongst suspected rebels also had a major effect in quieting the area. The local commander of government troops in Kings County, General Dunn, was particularly successful in collecting firearms. Indeed, even loyalists were requested to have their arms registered. In April 1798, Dunn had taken possession of over 1,000 muskets and countless other weapons, although a lack of pikes handed in showed that some were intent on the rebellion going ahead. General Dunn had also succeeded in having several defenders and United Irishmen prosecuted at the spring assizes of 1798, possibly helped by the brother of Patrick and James Stubbs, who had helped convict a notorious defender and robber at the previous sessions. This was in contrast to the 1797 assizes, when only one defender, a man named Farrell Cuff, had been sentenced. A government spy noted in early 1798 that there were some 6,500 United Irishmen active in Kings County in April. The arrest of United Irish leaders at Oliver Bond's house in Dublin on the 12th of March provided the government with evidence that a rebellion was being planned and ready to commence. The delegate of the United Irishmen for Kings County, who had been sent to the meeting of the Society's executive, was said to be a man named Flanagan from Tullamore, and he escaped arrest at Bond's house but soon turned informer, who in turn relayed vital information to General Dunn. The leaders of various baronies were apprehended and the plans for rebellion in Kings County foiled. Without this information from Flanagan, General Dunn commented that Kings County would have been as bad as Kildare when the rebellion eventually broke out in May. Despite the obvious success, the United Irishmen were still active in Kings County, and it was claimed that a man called John McMahon had left Dublin to call at camps for Kings County in advance of the outbreak of rebellion. On the 24th of May 1798, the failure of the mail train to arrive in County Kildare and adjoining counties signalled the start of the United Irishmen rebellion. Kildare was one of the first centres of activity, and in areas which adjoined Kings County, rebel activity soon flourished. According to Lieutenant Colonel Dunn, the rebels who had been in possession of the town of Rathangan towards the end of May intended, quote, to overrun the part of Kings County adjoining Kildare and to advance to Edenderry. The situation appeared to be desperate, and Dunn exclaimed that the yeomanry forces were not of much use in fighting the rebels. The protection of the entire Kings County was now left to 200 of the South Cork militia, and they had neither infantry or cannon to defend themselves. Many of the rebels were now camped at the bog of Timahoe in County Kildare, under the command of General William Aylmer. The contingent from Edenderry, now styling themselves the United Irishmen instead of the defenders, and led by a Captain Casey, marched towards the village of Carbery. Perturbed that his estate lay threatened, Lord Downshire claimed that Edenderry was, quote, a strong post and commands a general share of the country, and for this reason it was worthy of attention. Throughout the month of June, as more and more United Irishmen fleeing the fighting elsewhere, including in County Wexford, poured into the Midlands, Kings County stood on the brink of being invaded. The Battle of Fox's Hill, located 6 miles from the Kings County and Kildare border on the 30th of June, was a little known but intense clash, which again involved rebels and yeomanry from Kings County. The major of the Limerick City Militia, a man called John Ormsby, received word that a large body of rebels had assembled on a hill 6 miles from the town of Edenderry, and immediately proceeded to disperse them. The Edenderry yeomanry, under the Captain Wakely, were sent to cut off the rebels' retreat, and when Ormsby arrived, he found that some 300 men were ready to give battle. The rebels soon fled into the bog, where the yeomanry had them surrounded, and they were, quote, cut to pieces in every direction out of the bog. The number that were killed, Ormsby estimated at 100, which was said to have been a terrible loss for the rebel army. Among the casualties was Captain Casey, who had managed to kill 2 of the militia horses. He, along with his brother, were brought back to Edenderry and were later hanged in the town where they had been born. The capture of this elusive Captain Casey was a major bonus for the yeomanry, as he was seen as something of a heroic figure in rebel eyes. When he was captured, it was discovered that he was wearing the overcoat of James Spencer, the murdered yeoman from Rathangan in County Kildare, and he also had the boots belonging to Captain Semple, another yeoman killed in that attack. This, it would seem, definitely sealed his fate. While Hartigan was naturally disappointed, the military at Edenderry were still preparing themselves for an imminent attack on the town, and it was noted that the rebels were still in great force at Carberry Hill in nearby County Kildare. Colonel Goff of the Limerick City Militia immediately left Edenderry, accompanied by 200 dragoon guards and 10 of Captain Wakely's yeomanry to engage the rebels, and found that their march was, quote, easily traced, as they had left the entire country in flames where they had passed. Having passed through the village of Johnstown Bridge in County Kildare, which Goff found entirely consumed, and having been witness to their horrid conduct, he prepared to give them battle at a place called Knockderrig Hill, some 15 kilometres from Edenderry. The rebels were dispersed across the bog and countryside, and more than 150 of them were killed by the militia and yeomanry. Once again, the spirit and gallant manner of the officers and soldiers was crucial in the defeat of the rebels, who at this time were relieved of 16 fat bullock, 53 horses, and 7,000 yards of new linen. The final encounter of the Kings County rebels came with the defeat at the Battle of Knightstown Bog in County Meath, where, fleeing with the Wicklow and Wexford rebels they had hoped to link up with, their counterparts in Louth and Meath were also slaughtered. Retreating from this setback, Colonel Anthony Perry and the Reverend Mogue Kearns, leaders of the Wexford contingent, were captured at Clonbelogue in Kings County by 2 yeomanry officers, John Ridgway and Samuel Robinson. The location of their capture is still pointed out to this day and known as the Wheelabout. The Wexford rebels on this occasion were taken to the home of Shaw Cartland at Lumville between Edenderry and Road, and sentenced by court-martial to be hanged. The execution was duly carried out on the same day, the 21st of July, on a place called Blundell Hill in Edenderry, which overlooked the town. The rebellion of 1798, which had threatened this part of Kings County since late May, was finally crushed, but in other parts it lingered to the autumn of 1798. According to Paddy Heaney, 1,000 rebels gathered near Tullamore, ready to march to Wexford under James Morris's command in August. They were dispersed by a Reverend O'Mara, a Catholic priest from Tullamore, and when returning towards Edenderry, the local yeomanry routed them. And one of the final episodes of the 1798 rebellion in Kings County occurred in September, when the defeated French troops, fleeing from Ballina, Killala and other parts of Mayo, were caught and then transported through Edenderry along the Grand Canal on the way to Dublin. Along the route through Edenderry, people, it was said, gathered to see the French soldiers, who, with nonchalance and merriment, sang the Marseillaise on their way to Dublin. Although Kings County had been spared the general horrors of the rebellion when compared with other areas of the country, there still existed a simmering discontent in the aftermath of the rebellion. In September, a man called Pilkington Holman wrote to Lord Downshire, thanking him for the use of his house at Edenderry during the rebellion and stating that he wished to remain there until the winter had passed. The invasion of the French had influenced the minds of the rebellious people of Kings County, and his family's safety would be secured in this garrisoned town. A shortage of provisions and employment was not helped by the large numbers of people who had fled from the villages of Clonbelogue and Rotangan to the town of Edenderry. The hardships and dangers that the people endured had not been averted, and many were anxious in December of 1798 that the barrack of Edenderry would be filled to its full complement of 100 men. A detachment of 4 officers, 2 sergeants, 1 drum, and 50 rank-and-file soldiers were sent to Edenderry in late 1798 to augment the barrack. In the aftermath of the rebellion, There were many claims made to government for losses incurred during the summer of 1798. These included losses for goods, livestock, and damage to property, amongst other things. By and large, most of these claims were made in the northeast of Kings County, once again indicating that this part of Kings County was most severely affected. The motives of the rebels can be questioned when taking into account the items stolen from people, as it seems that some were just intent on providing for their families and took advantage of the public disorder which occurred in 1798 throughout Kings County to do so. The village of Clonbelogue, however, suffered greatly in the rebellion, and the rebels from the Downshire or Edenderry estate made off from their homes of people like James Moody, Henry Hickey and Michael Poole, with furniture, potatoes and clothes, amongst other items. The homes of yeomanry were not exempt either from plunder, as James Mooney discovered, the rebels taking bacon and sheep amongst several other household items. The damage that the rebels had caused to the Grand Canal between Edenderry and Dangan amounted to over £7,000, an obvious sign that 1798 was something which would be long remembered in the locality. Recalling a visit to Edenderry in 1817, John Gough highlighted how the rebellion of 1798 had reduced Edenderry from being a good town to a poor village. Likewise, Sir Charles Coote noted that the miserable and shabby appearance of the town, with many houses falling to ruin, was a direct result of the rebellion of 1798. The same was true of nearby village of Clonbelogue and of Phillipstown. Although the rebellion had been quashed in this part of Kings County, and many of the rebels brought to trial and imprisoned and listed for transportation, the Coulstown and Warrenstown yeomanry were still engaged in apprehending rebels as late as 1801. The stationing of the Kerry militia in Edenderry after the rebellion was said to have made a difference, but the magistrates still petitioned for a barrack and garrison to be established in that part of the county. At Phillipstown it was a similar scenario, and the inhabitants of the town looked for courts to be established for the several depredations which had been committed in the baronies adjoining by, they quoted, a desperate gang of villains who had infested it. Subscriptions had been offered to entice people to come forward with information regarding these atrocious acts, and for many, the idle effects of the rebellion were still obvious. Provisions of most kinds in Kings County were scarce, the peasantry suffering and surviving only on a diet of potatoes and oatmeal. The conditions of the poor were not helped by the arrival of beggars and Connacht cottiers to the road at Edenderry area, which prompted some heavy-handed tactics to remove them. Thus, Edenderry and the northeast part of Kings County entered the 19th century, continuing to dwindle into decline and unrest, much as it had done throughout the 1790s. According to the new Downshire agent at Edenderry, James Brownrigg, not a night would pass when there was not an act of plunder, where the peasants steal corn, dig potatoes, milk the cows, carry off the hay and turf, which they can do so in open and by open force. The fallout from the rebellion would continue for some time too, and as Tom Dunn has recently commented, 1798 never passed out of history because it never passed out of politics. And it didn't pass out of social memory either. And when the centenary of the 1798 rebellion was celebrated in 1898, the main nationalist clubs in Kings County evoked the memory of 98 and the United Irishmen as a means of pushing for Home Rule and separation from Britain. 1798 would continue to cast a long shadow. The defeat of the rebels at Fox's Hill in County Kildare was due mainly to the exertions of the Limerick City militia, who, General Ormsby claimed, have burned down every house and killed every man they met, had I not restrained them. His militia, he believed, were the most desperate fellows on earth, and I am sure loyal. Not a man received the slightest wound in the engagement. Ormsby also expressed gratitude to a man called George Brown from Edenderry, who had volunteered and was, quote, forward on all occasions, and who, seeing a rebel officer, took from him a large green standard, which was brought back to Edenderry. That same green standard, in 1950, was unfurled in Edenderry upon the visit of the President of Ireland, Shinrone O'Keefe. The success of the Edenderry yeomanry at Fox's Hill had helped avert the threat of a rebellion reaching Kings County in the first instance, and many rebels captured at Fox's Hill were brought back to Edenderry for court-martial. Their trials, which were postponed owing to the threat that still existed in the area, as William Hartigan mentioned to Lord Downshire, disillusioned many that the trials of traitors would be cancelled, and many despaired of ever seeing them hanged.
Recalling a visit to Edenderry in 1817, John Gough highlighted how the rebellion of 1798 had reduced Edenderry from being a good town to a poor village. Likewise, Sir Charles Coote noted that the miserable and shabby appearance of the town, with many houses falling to ruin, was a direct result of the rebellion of 1798. The same was true of nearby village of Clonbelogue and of Phillipstown. Although the rebellion had been quashed in this part of Kings County, and many of the rebels brought to trial and imprisoned and listed for transportation, the Coulstown and Warrenstown yeomanry were still engaged in apprehending rebels as late as 1801. The stationing of the Kerry militia in Edenderry after the rebellion was said to have made a difference, but the magistrates still petitioned for a barrack and garrison to be established in that part of the county. At Phillipstown it was a similar scenario, and the inhabitants of the town looked for courts to be established for the several depredations which had been committed in the baronies adjoining by, they quoted, a desperate gang of villains who had infested it. Subscriptions had been offered to entice people to come forward with information regarding these atrocious acts, and for many, the idle effects of the rebellion were still obvious. Provisions of most kinds in Kings County were scarce, the peasantry suffering and surviving only on a diet of potatoes and oatmeal. The conditions of the poor were not helped by the arrival of beggars and Connacht cottiers to the road at Edenderry area, which prompted some heavy-handed tactics to remove them. Thus, Edenderry and the northeast part of Kings County entered the 19th century, continuing to dwindle into decline and unrest, much as it had done throughout the 1790s. According to the new Downshire agent at Edenderry, James Brownrigg, not a night would pass when there was not an act of plunder, where the peasants steal corn, dig potatoes, milk the cows, carry off the hay and turf, which they can do so in open and by open force. The fallout from the rebellion would continue for some time too, and as Tom Dunn has recently commented, 1798 never passed out of history because it never passed out of politics. And it didn't pass out of social memory either. And when the centenary of the 1798 rebellion was celebrated in 1898, the main nationalist clubs in Kings County evoked the memory of 98 and the United Irishmen as a means of pushing for Home Rule and separation from Britain. 1798 will continue to cast a long shadow.